Hello everyone, my name is Kay Park. I have a question for you. What do you use the most often throughout the day? Personally, I use my phone the most. Wherever we go, our phones become our essentials. Today, I wanted to talk to you about how people during the Joseon Dynasty have dealt with the functions of phones that we have. If you see here on my phone screen, you can see various functions like calling on our phones, text messages, checking our time schedules, and even using the camera to document stuff. I'll be introducing how people back in the days used alternative products to replace these functions. Let's get on into it. I think the most important and frequently used functions on our phones will be the calling and texting ability. Especially nowadays when the government sends us over a dozen emergency disaster messages about the happenings of COVID or various natural disaster alerts. Do you think that the people during the Joseon Dynasty sent emergency disaster alerts to each other like we do nowadays? Of course they did. They used the system called 봉수. It was a military communication device using smoke during the day and fire at night to signal the other parts of the country of what happened in each region. There were various stations of 봉수 throughout the country and they alerted each other of various events like if a war was to break out and the enemy will approach some point of region and etc. Other than the 봉수, there were actual telephones that were available for use as the Western culture started to come into Korea as the time passed by. For the first time in Joseon Dynasty, there was a telephone that was installed in 1896 connecting the palace and the Incheon port office that was introduced from an official that went to the Cheong Dynasty. Normal people couldn't use the telephone since it was installed in the palace, but some officials could use it. Before picking up the phone, they were required to tidy their uniforms and bow down to the telephone 4 times, which was because the phone contained the voices of the king, who was considered holy. The general use of telephones opened up to the public from 1902 March 20th, which was in Incheon, and the other one was in the Seoul capital. At first, you had to go to a phone booth to get a ticket to call. The available time for the call was from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. and it was about $30 for 5 minutes of calling time. The next function that I use the most from my phone is the camera function. We use the camera function to capture moments and document people. Before the camera existed during the Joseon Dynasty, good artists in the country auditioned to be royal painters where they would paint portraits of the king and the royal family and sometimes even the officials. The standard to be the royal artist was the person that could draw the most accurately and express the most realistically. As the time passed and the Western culture started to influence the Joseon culture, it was found that cameras were actually used starting from the 1780s. Not the actual cameras itself, but more like the skill that led to the development of the cameras, which was actually called the Camera Obscura. Camera Obscura actually means the dark box, which it is said in one of the documents that the famous scientist Jung Yak-yong has left that they used the Camera Obscura tool in order to draw the sketches of the portraits in the royal palace or for some artists. It is hypothesized that the Camera Obscura tool had been imported to Joseon from China. They would put a piece of paper at a certain distance from the light that came into the dark box through a tiny hole, and then they would use the logic where they would make the subject reflect upside down on the screen. It was possible for the artist to make an accurate and detailed portrait based on the reflection of the paper when they sketched because it seemed like they were tracing a picture. It wasn't until the end of the Joseon Dynasty period that the camera began to be used by the royals. Among the 27 kings of the Joseon Dynasty, there were pictures of the 26th and the 27th king that were taken. By the early 1880s, the newly made camera machine had been introduced to the public, making them widely accessible for normal people as well. Then they started to use cameras like the way we are using them today on our phones. Now with technological advancements, they have simply become a function embedded into our devices, like our phones that we use on a daily basis. Other than the functions that I've introduced, there were other variations of the 21st century phone that were used back in the Joseon dynasty. For instance, there was the sun and water clock that was used as a clock function nowadays, like you can see here on my phone. And also there were other objects that were used in different circumstances, like banking methods or just the apps that you can look online, which was also portrayed as the maps that people actually found during those days, like the 대동여지도 or various maps that were made by our ancestors. Besides that, even just the simple internet searches that we are familiar with right now, we can casually Google our curiosities or can be seen in different forms when we compare the two technological backgrounds. Isn't it interesting how you can see the similarities and differences between the two? As we get a broader sense of tech and access to various functionalities, we should think of it as a privilege and respect the stepping stones that our ancestors set. Thank you so much.